Well, good morning. Our speaker today is Gisela Zebroski. Gisela is originally Latvian by birth, but as often happens to the people who grew up in this period in Eastern Europe, she made her way around and finally got to California, where she became a American writer and historian. And Gisela's topic today is the Berlin Airlift in 1948, something which I'm fascinated to hear everything about. Gisela, it's yours.
Thank you, George. Yes, this is a big story. I mean, really big story. Most people heard or know about the Berlin Airlift, but very few people know what it was really all about. Namely, number one, that it prevented World War III. It was as big as that. Also, that it had nothing to do with Berlin or Germany or World War II. This was the next episode to take place in Stalin's mind, who had not given up on losing the rest of Berlin. He wanted the whole city and, of course, getting all of Germany. He had this beautifully planned, and he had tried to get it during the Yalta Treaty and definitely during the Potsdam Conference. In both cases, America stood straight and tight. Neither Roosevelt nor Truman were about to be urged to give up what was rightfully theirs. As a matter of fact, Truman said, "I will not surrender what American men fought and died for." And this is the big issue here. When Stalin blocked all land access routes, and all land access routes to Berlin, he took 2.3 million Berliners hostage. I would call this grand scale blackmail. Unless the West surrendered, West Berlin, these people would starve to death, and knowing Stalin, he just might go through with it. And here are our heroes who came to the rescue of the hungry people of Berlin and even the hungry children of Berlin, which, as you will hear, is part of this very big story, which I just love to tell. Now, I was 13 when all this happened and happened to live in West Germany, namely in Stuttgart. We were refugees from Latvia, as you just heard. And for us, having the Soviets breathe down our neck and possibly showing up and catching us again, they tried to do that back in 1917, when they, during the Russian Revolution, where my family could flee, and then again in 1939, when they occupied Latvia. And now they would be, unless the West stood their ground, they would be coming through, and I would tell you that it would not just have stopped at Berlin, it would have been all of Europe. So by winning the airlift, by winning the blockade of Berlin, not only did it prevent World War III, it also kept Europe out of the hands of the Soviets. So as you can see, this was really, really a big event. Well, let's start history. History is always wonderful to start from, and we might as well go back to World War II, the end thereof. Germany surrendered unconditionally in 1945 and was divided, as everybody knows, into 4 zones. And these zones were taken by the West, United States, Russia, United States, UK, and France. And then here's Russia, all in red and beautiful. And the city of Berlin, here in the heart of the Russian territory, also divided into 4 zones with a similar situation. Now, all goods, supplies, and everything else came through railroad and the Autobahn and whatnot that supplied. There was nothing coming out of East. Everything that was needed in the western part of Berlin had to be brought in from the west. Now, by blocking all these accesses, which, if you believe it or not, were settled upon on a handshake, there remained these 3 air corridors. They were 20-mile wide, and they had been ratified. Some very smart person thought ahead and thought, well, at least we need something in case. Well, the in case happened. Truman was not in a good position whatsoever. First of all, the State Department, Defense Department, nobody wanted to support the idea of an airlift. What was more, he was in an election year, and an election he was about to lose because there was a front runner of Tom Dewey. And finally, the Defense Department was cut to a minimum and the troops demilitarized. That means he had 80,000 occupation forces in Germany, which is pretty good, and 5,000 people in Berlin, including dependents. But look at Stalin. He had not demilitarized anybody. On the contrary, he had beefed up his army and supplied it with the wonderful weaponry and materiel that he had received from the Americans to support World War II. So he was well equipped with 2.5 million men to march into Europe. He had 500,000 men in and around Berlin. Well, now you can see that our president didn't have much defense to speak of. So when he was conferring and talking to the US High Commissioner for Germany, who was at the time General Lucius D. Clay, I said, well, you know what? It's really not a big blockade. There's nothing special there other than a bar across the street and across the railroad tracks. We just run it over and that's it. Just don't play this game with him. But on second thought, they realized that by doing this, they invaded Soviet territory. This was exactly what Stalin wanted them to do. Then he had a legitimate reason to defend himself, and there it was, World War III, that only he could win. He was prepared. As a matter of fact, he was so prepared that now we understand that it would have taken him 48 hours, not only to occupy Berlin, but to go all the way to the British Channel. That, of course, included all of Germany. And who would stop him from taking France and Italy? They had plenty of comrades in their ranks and absolutely no defense. So as you know, Stalin was a great politician and a very smart guy when it came to doing things for the Soviet Union. He was in a very good position to win World War III without much help, without much pain. So there it was, General Clay and President Truman were sitting there and wondering, how are we going to get an airlift into operation? Nonetheless, they had no choice, and our president, being the man of action, who said the buck stops here, and I will not surrender what American men have fought and died for, and we shall stay, and that is what he did. So here are the 3 men who decided the issue. There is Attlee, who was the Prime Minister of Britain, And he reluctantly, very reluctantly, followed Struman's idea and supplied 30% of the operation, which he called plain fare. All the rest was kind of in the hands of Truman, and he really had a huge problem. As you can imagine, the airlift was off to a very rocky start. First of all, he lacked all means for it. Secondly, Berlin was in total ruins. There were just rickety, nothing meaningful airfields that had to be leveled and had to be set up for planes of the caliber of the C-54 Skymaster to land. But nonetheless, he was not budging, and he was starting his airlift. Fortunately, it was summer and things could work. However, within 3 weeks, it didn't. He had supplies for 40 days, all right? So by the time 3 weeks were up, we were hitting those 40 days, and there was no way he could hope to feed these 2.3 million people, at least to the survival level, never mind really feeding them. And of course, they needed coal and everything else. But destiny being what it is, destiny in this time was on the side of the West. And this destiny had a man for him who knew how to run a big-time airlift, and his name was General William Tunner. Now, William Tunner was not only a gifted administrator, he had already conducted a giant airlift in China very successfully. And he came and took charge. Well, first of all, he cajoled Washington into delivering at least half of the C-54 Skymasters he needed. Then he figured, well, of course, he needed mechanics to service the airplanes. There weren't any. So he decided to hire German mechanics. German mechanics were idle. They were not allowed to work. There were all these restrictions for Germany. So they were more than happy, not only to have a job again, but to be an ally and support the airlift. Because this was a political issue. Nobody wanted the Russians in Berlin. Nobody definitely wanted the Russians in Germany or any place for that matter. So now, instead of being despised enemies, they were allies. Well, this is truly a big deal. And here are our feuding friends. Let's see how this develops further. So with the mechanics taking care of the airplanes, and the next step was pilots being who they are. They like to dawdle off and not being exactly disciplined and punctual. Well, General Tunner knew all that, so he decided and set up food trucks, which he manned with pretty German girls who flirted with pilots. And now Berlin became a social gathering. They were having a grand time coming to Berlin and waiting for their load to be unloaded and flying back and talk to the girls and meet their friends and so on. So things were definitely looking up. In the meantime, Washington softened up and they could see that this really was an important matter. However, the American electorate took a long time to understand that Berlin and the airlift was very exciting, and you can't just rest on your laurels and sit back and live in peace, because peace is not that easy to have. So and finally, our president won the election, which was also a big step in the right direction. And you may remember, of course, you know, the Gettysburg Address. And when Truman's situation was rocked down under, he didn't have a foot to stand on. He delivered supposedly a speech that was as powerful as the Gettysburg Address because it came from his heart. He discarded his notes and just started to speak over the radio, which was pretty much the only communication possible at the time, and moved the people into what was really at stake here. So now we are starting to roll. This would have really led to victory, but it wasn't supposed to be as simple as all that. So there was a big obstacle, namely, and you wouldn't believe this, German winter. Yes, that is a big obstacle because it is dark, heavy fog and limited daylight, as well as cold. Now, the Soviets, before all this happened, had already stolen the 2 power plants out of West Berlin, expecting the Berliners and, of course, the West occupation forces to buy the energy from him, and therefore making them dependent. Well, Americans are not the kind of guys you think, that he thought. So they brought in new power plants that they set up and delivered the electricity. But Stalin was not done yet. He had more things in mind to stop the Allies from just simply bringing in food and goods. So he set up hundreds of fighter planes to harass the heavily loaded airplanes and kind of get them to veer off their mark. And then they could be shot down for invading Soviet territory. Fortunately, the pilots did not flinch. You also have to remember, or maybe you don't know, that they were flying in 5 levels of altitude, 0 visibility, no radar, and very limited territory. Not a single plane veered off or was shot down. They kind of went through all these obstacles and survived. And well, we won't go into winter anymore because I'm going to tell you another story. And this, first of all, I have to tell you that the coal here had to come from as far away as Great Falls, Montana. It was loaded into railroad cars. It had to be shipped through the United States, had to be loaded to ships on the Atlantic, had to go across the Atlantic, had to be loaded in, again, train cars and trucks and shipped to the airports in Germany. And there, they had to be packed into sacks to fit the tight openings of the airplanes. And these, again, had to be flown to Berlin, where they were unloaded and distributed. So you can see, this was a major, major operation. And the fact that Tunner had this rolling like the beat of a jungle drum within weeks is what we call a miracle. But here we are back, just to give you a picture of where we are and what's happening. And we're coming back to Berlin. Here it is after an air raid, and here it is already cleaned up. And our story takes place between 1948 and 1949. The airlift lasted 11 months. But here comes another miracle. And his name is Hal Halverson. Hal Halverson was a young pilot from Utah, shuttling back and forth from Frankfurt to Berlin. And being the kind of guy he was, he desperately wanted to see the city. Only he was not supposed to leave the airfield by any means. And of course, with his flying time, he had barely enough time to sleep. But he was determined. And so he managed to arrange with his buddy to take over his shift, and managed to find a Jeep and managed to get off the airfield, but did not get very far because he ran into these children who were watching him behind his barbed wire fence. Unlike children in other countries he'd been to would come screaming and shouting, "Chocolate, give me chocolate." These children just stood there and said absolutely nothing. He couldn't understand why. Why didn't they say anything? So he got off his Jeep and he got off and started walking toward them. Well, they just kind of looked at him and kind of smiled, but still nothing, no reaction. But he thought they were the sweetest kids. So he fished in his pockets and came up with 2 sticks of chewing gum. That was all he had. He figured better that than nothing. He broke them in halves and handed the 4 halves to 4 of the kids. Well, rather than grabbing this gum and running, hey, guess what I got? They broke it up some more and shared it with their friends. And then they unwrapped, and then the paper, they passed the paper out. Oh, it smelled so good. Halverson, and then they thanked him in English. Halverson couldn't believe his eyes. He thought, these are not enemies. These are hungry children. And so he got into talking to them. And they asked all kinds of questions. And of course, they asked, would he save them from the Russians? Before they knew it, they became friends. They just had a great time. And in leaving, Halverson said, you know, kids, tomorrow I'm going to drop some candy from my plane. Oh, thank you, they said, thank you. And the little girl there said, but how will we know your plane? Let's see, simple. I'll wiggle my wings. And with that, he was really happy getting back to his plane and flying back to Frankfurt. And there, he talked to his buddies. And he asked them to donate their candy rations for the hungry kids of Berlin. They were glad to do that, and they made little packages and put a handkerchief like for a parachute so they would land safely. So the next day, kids were there waiting for him, and there was a candy coming from the sky. Santa Claus finally remembered that there were hungry children in Berlin, and he was very, very excited. And there's a little recipient. But he just couldn't leave well enough alone. And he was so moved by this that he decided he would do another run. And that's what he did. Following day, he had another bunch of packages for the kids and dropped them. But then that was it, because he knew it was highly irregular and he could be punished for it, and better not to fool around. But he couldn't help it. Then that a whole bunch of letters arrived to the post addressed to Uncle Wiggly Wings. Well, it seems that at the post, the people knew who Uncle Wiggly Wings was, and those letters landed in his box. Good things like that don't usually remain unnoticed. So when he was called in by his commanding officer, he knew he was in trouble for sure. And was he surprised when he was shown the front page of the Frankfurter Zeitung praising the generosity of American pilots? Well, obviously, General Tunner had seen it after all. He's the man in charge. So he called, said, well, all right, we do need good rep for Washington and a bit of good media coverage was more than welcome. But in the future, do keep me informed. And thus this whole new operation was launched. Halverson became spokesman for the Berlin Airlift and for the Hungry Kids of Berlin, and the media, of course, it is a super story, picked it up immediately because Americans didn't get enough good stories at the time. So that the kids, and most of all the candy manufacturers, donated literally tons of candies and chocolates. And of course, the women's clubs and the churches and the schools helped out and came in. And here are all these wonderful gifts arriving at the post. And here is our friend Hal Halverson, who received the name the Candy Bomber. So he was still shuttling back and forth. He was also telling the world about the candy drops. And by spring, and not yet by spring, it was still winter. And I have to tell you that this was winter, in a very bleak winter. And the mayor, the Berlin mayor, Ernst Reuter, appealed to the world. We cannot be negotiated. We cannot be bargained. People of the world, look at Berlin. Berliners needed hope, and with the candy, it was starting to come. And then spring came, and you know how spring is. It uplifts us. Yes, new life, new hope. By the late spring, this operation was running like the beat of a jungle drum. Everyone was moving. 57,000 people worked on the airlift. Can you picture that? 23 tons of candies were dropped in Berlin. Not bombs, but candies. Kids were running all over the place looking for candies. They sent letters and maps so the pilots would find their home so that they could drop candies for them. And they give the story of the candy bomber. You have to read his biography and you have to read some of the background of candy bombers. It's just so fascinating. It's something everyone should know about and be happy and be proud. So anyway, here everything is running, and we are heading toward May. And one nice day, here are our planes. Oh, before I tell you that, I will tell you the numbers. 278,000 flights covered, 110 million miles, and delivered 4.6 billion pounds of goods to Berlin. Still a lot cheaper than World War III, mind you. So one nice day, Stalin gave up. The bars were lifted. You can go now, the roads are fixed. We're done. Obviously, this was a huge celebration. You can see, and here it's written here. And here is our hero, General Tunner. Yes, he made this thing happen. He created Mission Impossible and created the miracle that he then accomplished. And in the American way, when you're done with something, you can sell it, you don't need it anymore. And so therefore he is selling a slightly used airline, one well-equipped airfield, because obviously present owners are going out of business. They are done. There's so much to celebrate, and the Berliners celebrated the airlift, and that their people and their city was saved from the Russians with this monument that depicts the 3 air corridors through which all the goods were flown in. And all is well that ends well. Never underestimate man's desire to keep his freedom. And this is our grand finale. Well deserved. No need to carry grudges or anger when there is so much to be grateful for. End of story.